I think it's fair to say that I spend a good part of every single day thinking about how to write a stronger story. And I do spend part of every day helping writers just like you improve their stories as well. And one of the things that's really, really important is a story that moves forward inexorably. So some of my writing clients ask me to help them because they feel a little bit lost in their story. And that makes a lot of sense because they are lacking one very crucial element that would help their story really hold together and move forward just super compellingly with strong causality and something that would keep them from ending up with writer's block or a mushy middle. What do all stories need? They need conflict. Without conflict, your story just stands still. Without conflict, there's no need to move forward. Without conflict, there's no character growth in your story. And you need character growth to have something compelling that the audience or reader can really get into. So what do you need if you're trying to create conflict? You need an antagonist. And not only do you need an antagonist, you need a damn good one. Even a work of nonfiction, even a business book needs an antagonist. An antagonist is not necessarily that caricature of a villain. It's not necessarily that guy with the mustache that he's twirling and a white cat and an evil laugh. And it doesn't have to be a genius, mass murderer, Dr. Evil type. I mean, those are fun. But an antagonist just needs to be the embodiment of the antagonistic forces that are challenging your hero or your main character as they try to reach their goal. And that is storytelling. Good storytelling is showing your protagonist being able to win despite all of these things that are stacked against them. A good story with good character development is essentially the story of a victory over some things. Even if the ending ends up being about a loss or about it's a sad ending, there's been some kind of victory or some kind of realization that happens. All of that character growth, all of that change, all of that causality doesn't happen just because of the independent actions of a protagonist. They happen because of the actions of the antagonist. Having a strong, powerful antagonist is the only way to really help that protagonist arc of yours be fully realized. So today in the podcast, we're going to be talking about writing a really good antagonist. We're going to be talking about things such as different types of villain or different types of antagonistic forces that you can have in your book. We're going to be talking about ways to make your antagonist absolutely unforgettable. We're going to be talking about the different purposes that your antagonist serves and what kind of scenes they can and should appear in. So I think that all of these things are going to help you to see that sometimes a story is not just driven by the main character. Here's a little secret. Sometimes your antagonist actually holds the best cards at the beginning of your story. Many times, to create a great internal suspense, your antagonist actually starts off with more chances of winning. Your protagonist is going to prevail, if they prevail, against really strong odds. So today I think that no matter how much of a handle you think you have on writing a good antagonist, I think that if you stick around, you're probably going to learn a few things that you had no idea about. So I'm really excited to present these things to you. And if you are a writing coach on demand person, which is really exciting and fun, you're going to be getting some bonus materials with this episode, including talking about your antagonist's backstory and kind of some fun worksheets that are going to help you to elaborate a really good antagonist. So that's going to be super helpful, and you're going to have some antagonist writing prompts as well that I think will help you, especially if you're stuck and you're thinking that your antagonist is a little bit basic. We don't want that. We want your antagonist to be really unforgettable as well as the protagonist. This is what's going to give real texture to your book. Again, not just a fiction book, any kind of book needs antagonistic forces to prevail against. So thank you for joining me, and let's get started. If you're a writer dreaming of becoming a successful author, join me, writing coach Karena Akhavein, on the How to Be an Author podcast, your weekly source for writing information, inspiration, and motivation. So let's start talking about this villain, right? The typical villain that you might want to be talking about if you're talking about an antagonist. There are several different tropes when it comes to these villains. There are some that are a little bit cliche, but let's talk about all of them, because really you can try to do a twist on any of these and end up being a little bit original. So the first type of villain that you could think about using is the cliche one, which is the evil villain, right? It's cliche, but you know what? All cliches start off being a cliche because they're actually kind of a great idea. So if you do it right, this evil villain can still be super fun and effective, right? You want this villain to inspire fear. You want them to be cruel, intimidating. You want them to be a destabilizing force that introduces powerful chaos into your book. You want them to possibly be mercurial. They're going to be powerful in crucial ways. But if you really want to be avoiding this cliche, you do need to show their humanity. And part of this is explaining their backstory, right? Find your why. You know that expression? Simon Sinek has a great book called Find Your Why, which is essentially a business book, but I really recommend that authors read this book because it's all about finding what drives you. And if you look at your characters through this angle of finding your why, that's a really great way of giving them a strong goal with really logical reasons behind it. So if your villain has completely absorbed and encapsulated their why, it makes the cruelty of their actions more believable because it gives them internal logic. And internal logic is always key. You don't want your reader to think, oh, it's impossible for anyone to just be this evil unless they're completely psycho. No, you want them to say, oh, that's really terrible, but okay, I'm starting to understand why they've become that way over time, because maybe their mom was mean to them, or maybe they lost a sibling, or maybe someone stole their favorite toy and then things just completely fell apart from there. There's so many reasons why a villain becomes a villain, and try to come up with a really interesting backstory. The next type of villain is more of a guy or girl next door. This is the villain that is actually a little bit more nuanced because it's not like they're that evil. It's that they are acting in opposition to our protagonist. They are standing in the way of our protagonist getting to their goal because they probably have a completely different value system maybe, or maybe their backstory involves your protagonist in some way that means that they have a little bit of a conflictual relationship, right? Maybe they're exes. Maybe they're jealous of them. Maybe the protagonist got something that they wanted and now they want to destroy them, right? Maybe they want the same things for different reasons, or sometimes you can have an antagonist like this that's actually acting for reasons that they think are good, like they're trying to protect the protagonist against themselves, right? So all of these things can be really interesting, and this is a great opportunity to create an antagonist that is really well matched to your protagonist because they may have some similarities. They may have similar backstories. They may have similar traits. They might have a story together at some point. Because of the ordinary, believable aspect of this character, the conflict becomes easy to understand, but you do need to make sure that their goals are really strong and that they really, really care about certain things, because the tension needs to be high enough that it creates that character growth the same way that a really evil antagonist would. So, for example, you can kind of play this protagonist and antagonist relationship up in an interesting way where the protagonist thinks that this antagonist, despite the fact that they are the person next door, maybe they're the nosy neighbor, or maybe they're a teacher, or maybe they're somebody's boss, but they become much more powerful and formidable in the protagonist's eyes because of the power that they hold over them, right? Think about how your protagonist can think that this character is not only out to get them, but definitely holds the power in this situation, right? If you believe that your boss is about to fire you and you really need the job and everything else, that character is going to be quite the antagonist to you as soon as they start working against the things that you think you want, like the promotion that you were hoping to get, for example. But maybe they're trying to prevent you from getting the promotion because they're trying to protect you and line you up for the next promotion. But your character doesn't know that, right? So this is kind of interesting because if you give this character some really logical motivations, that can make your reader unsure who to root for, but also kind of really ping-ponging in the story. This is really fun too if you have unreliable narrators. You can have a lot of fun with this kind of antagonistic relationship where you really wonder, wait a second, is this guy the good guy or is that the good guy? I have no idea. And that's a fun read. Another type of antagonist is the powers that be. This is one of those things that you often see in dystopias, or you might see it in science fiction. Think of books like Divergent, for example, or The Hunger Games, or something like that, right? It's this system that exists, or like even The Handmaid's Tale, right? Think about a legal system or a government, or, maybe a school that has really strict rules, or maybe there's, a family that has some messed up traditions, right? These things are not necessarily inherently bad, though they can be. But the important thing is they're keeping your protagonist from their goal. So what's really key in this is that if you're having an antagonist that's kind of the powers that be, it's going to be easier for you to personify this power. By character, like you need a character that embodies this power that be, right? So, it could be, again, the symbol of, if the powers that be is a messed up corporate structure, well, the antagonist is the boss who's intent on ruining your character's life. Or, maybe you have, if it's a family thing, right? It's like the mom who is going to ground your character because they wanted to go to this party and now they're not going to be able to do it. Right? So that can be kind of fun. And also in these powers that be antagonists, you can have your character be kind of nuanced where, for example, you have a character that's very honorable, that has these very strong values, but they're kind of willing to go to extreme lengths to uphold those values. And they could actually end up hurting people or even killing people because of these values. Like think of the environmentalist who's like, I'm going to go blow up this whaling boat. Well, yeah, okay, that's great for the whales, but think about the people on the boat, right? So this is an interesting kind of person. Or think about the lawmaker who's like, I'm going to do a law that's going to, protect these people from this section of the population, but actually it's going to really ruin the livelihoods of this whole other group, for example. Right? And sometimes they don't quite realize what's going on. Sometimes they want to save one person, but they're going to hurt the other, and they're really torn. And that can be really interesting. Other antagonists, like in this concept, could be, nature, or it could be technology. It could be some kind of supernatural entity. But usually when you're dealing with things like that, really make sure that there's a link to what's going on with your protagonist as well. This is something that we're going to be touching on later in the podcast, but it's really important for your antagonist to kind of hold a mirror up to your protagonist. So whatever your protagonist's internal struggle already is, these kind of, powers that be are going to bring that out of them. Very, very important. So I think that's a key thing to realize. If you're going to take this whole idea a little bit further, another antagonist is, the self, right, is the enemy within. This is where your protagonist is their own antagonist. And this is really easy to believe because many times, protagonists are flawed. This is what makes them relatable. They have maybe a messed up backstory that they've been trying to rise beyond, or they've been trying to, push past some kind of problem that they have, whether it's a handicap or something they did wrong or some kind of difficulty they're having. Think of the author who has writer's block, or think about, the person who's got an addiction and who's going to do things that aren't really logical. So, these are some of these interesting things where your protagonist has a fatal flaw and they're still sympathetic, but this fatal flaw is really going to make it really hard for them to try to rise above all of this. And sometimes you can have secondary bad guys that come in, but really when you think about it, those secondary bad guys are kind of the fault of your protagonist and are a direct result of their internal struggle. So I think it's fun. There's a series that I really enjoy watching, which is called Good Girls. And it's about these, suburban moms basically, and they just make a series of really bad decisions. And one of the antagonists is this really kind of compelling, charmingly evil gangbanger, basically. But the whole reason he's there is because these women are their own worst enemies. They're the ones who summoned this guy, and they're the ones who keep him around. So that's a really interesting thing, that you have this very sinister character that they brought it upon themselves. And I really, really like that. So when you have these weird enemies within, make sure that there's like a specific goal that's standing out, and give that character a specific trait that is specifically going to impede that one goal. And make sure, that your reader is pretty perceptive. But when it is a battle like this with yourself, or even a battle with any kind of protagonist or an antagonist, we're going to talk about this too. Like, how many scenes do these things happen in? All of them. You want a lot of your scenes to be containing some kind of struggle or tension. And many times, even if it's not the key antagonist, you are showing antagonistic forces and tension. I always tell you that if you're stuck in your book, you're going to be introducing more obstacles. Well, every single one of these obstacles is often going to be the sign of some kind of antagonistic force, whether or not it's your main villain. Every scene is going to have some kind of a challenge like that. So you can have multiple antagonists in a single story, for sure, but definitely make sure that you are staying on track with what the main problem is and what the main struggle of your main character is, because you don't want your story to get diluted and lose momentum and get lost. This is a problem that I see a lot of my writers having, is that they have all these sinister characters because they are darn fun to write, but the story's getting lost. The momentum is going away. And I feel that with each different type of conflict, you are losing some of that strength and some of that power. So I have a whole list of ways to kind of improve your antagonist, or different things to think about, because people know these things instinctively, or maybe they read about how to write a good antagonist, but then they're like, I'm still stuck. What are some of the other things I should be thinking about when I'm writing an antagonist? Well, I'm going to give you a bunch of things that you should be thinking about. And then if you're one of my Writing Coach on Demand people, you're going to be getting a full-on checklist, and you're going to be getting kind of a full how-to of how to make sure that your antagonist is as good as they could be. So one of the things that I really like to do sometimes is that it's kind of human nature. Normally, you're going to come up with a character that you like, and maybe that character is a villain, and then that's great. But usually your character is your protagonist, right? Is the main character of your story. So you know what they're like, and you know what they want. But if you're kind of wondering what your antagonist is, think about who or what is the type of character or type of force that can best keep this character that I've created away from their goal. Right? And think about, maybe how they echo your main character. Have they gone through a quest similar to what your main character is going through? And have they failed? Is this why they're messed up? And is this why they're fighting against your main character? Think about that backstory, but definitely reverse engineer them so that they are the best villain or worst villain that you can possibly have. Remember that your villain's goal is definitely just as powerful as your protagonist's goal. That's really, really important. And they don't have to be the same goal. And it doesn't have to be so direct as my protagonist wants this and my villain does not want this. It can be my protagonist wants this and my villain wants that, which is going to prevent my protagonist from getting this. So it doesn't have to be the same exact goal, and it doesn't have to be a goal for the same reasons or even same types of reason, but there has to be some disconnect or some lack of alignment somewhere, some fundamental problem or misunderstanding that makes it that these two characters are absolutely antagonistic forces for each other. Now, think about, for example, if you want to think in the write what you know optics, right? Think about different real life villains you've encountered or that you've read about, something that has emotionally affected you very strongly, right? Like, let's say that in your family, you've got somebody who's, misbehaving and, working really hard to hurt somebody else. Or let's say, your friend got hurt by someone, or let's say that you're listening to conversation, you're going, oh my God, I can't believe people would do this to each other. Or maybe you're reading the news and you're going, oh my God, this person sounds absolutely horrifying. How could they possibly do that? Well, try to think about what motivated them. You're going to have some reporting on what exactly caused this behavior. So try to analyze that and try to draw parallel to other things that you've experienced. Think about times that you clashed with someone over something. And this is going to give you examples of what a dialogue could sound like between a protagonist and an antagonist, or a dialogue could sound like about an antagonist. Another thing that's definitely going to help you to build a super antagonist is, again, write what you know. Think about your greatest fears, or think about the thing that you want or like least. Think about that. You can definitely add that to your villain's character profile. And it doesn't have to be that literal at all, right? But think more metaphorically or symbolically. Like, for example, you don't like spiders. Well, your antagonist, okay, we could go super literal. They could have a spider tattooed on their neck, right? But also, what if they've got skinny, hairy arms and they move in this disconcertingly spider-like way? Think about that. That's a really fun characteristic. Or maybe they collect poisonous spiders and they feed them things and they like to watch the spider cornering their prey and, creating a web, and they're entranced by it and it's absolutely terrifying and scary to you. You're going to be able to describe this thing in a really great way. And that fear that you have as the author is going to shine through in your descriptions, and it's going to be pretty cool. Now, be super honest with yourself. Do you have a really strong internal struggle that you've had now or in the past? Even something that you overcame. Think about that. Think about how powerful it was. Think about when you were absolutely taken over by something that wasn't necessarily positive. I have a friend who's a writer who went through a struggle with being an alcoholic, for example, and she has such powerful segments that she writes about where she doesn't write about a literal alcoholic, but she uses some of that feeling of powerlessness, but also of something controlling you. It really informs her writing in the most amazing way. Now, I'm not recommending you go off and develop substance abuse issues or, make up some kind of struggle. I'm just saying, if you ever had anything where you were conflicted or where you felt that you weren't truly yourself or that you weren't the type of person you wanted to be, use radical honesty and use it to create your villain. That can be really, really compelling. I've mentioned how the antagonist should mirror the protagonist in some way. And this is really important. Look at the things in your upbringing or in your experience, for example, or in your values that expressed in a somewhat different way or taken to an extreme could be absolutely disastrous. Think about that, right? Think about things that have happened to you and you've reacted in one way and it made you react well, but you could have reacted in a different way and then you would have been the bad guy. Think about that. That can really enrich your discussion about an antagonist. Now, one really fun thing that I like when I'm talking about villains and antagonists, I think about the naming of them. I think that sometimes it can be a fun opportunity to either inflect your text with either foreshadowing, if the reader doesn't quite know yet that they're the antagonist, some kind of foreshadowing that was very subtle, or something that is actually humorous by, creating something that is at odds with who they are, right? A really dark character with a super bimbo-y name, for example, or maybe your antagonist has a sinister name that sounds sinister, or maybe they have a nickname that they've given themselves because they don't feel that their given name actually is aligned with who they are now, right? Think about all these different ways that antagonists are named or that evil characters are named. I think it's a really fun thing to do. Your characters' names are not 100% crucial, but they're definitely one of the fun parts of writing, and they can definitely add to the mood of your story and to the feel of your story. It's almost something that your reader will notice it, but maybe they'll think that the associations that they have in their mind are just accidental, but it really does impact how they read your character. So also, by the way, I keep saying villain and antagonist, remember to give your antagonist some qualities, right? They might be messed up, but they have a moral code, right? They have a value system, or even if they're a total psycho, they have some qualities. Maybe they're really good at art. Maybe they really like puppies. I don't know what it is, but I think that some good quality that makes them, if not likable, at least relatable or understandable, I think that that's really great. Think about all those distinctive traits that you get in these villains in books or movies that people love to hate. That's really, really fun, right? Think about what those distinctive traits are. Could they be a unique way of speaking or, some talent, some stroke of genius, something like that? I think that that's really, really fun. And also remember that your main character and your antagonist have this in common, which is, they have this whole other life other than what's going on in the story, right? So really, what is your villain doing outside of the times when they're actually interacting with or acting against your protagonist, right? Where do they live? What do they like to do? What do they hate to do? What are their relationships like? That could be really interesting. So I think also if you want your antagonist to be realistic and not completely hateable, give them a really painful backstory, because that makes it that they're almost not able to come out of that unscathed. And so basically your reader is going to be like, okay, I get it. They're not entirely evil, or there's still some kind of hope for them, right? That could be very interesting. I think also sometimes it's kind of fun to have an antagonist that you love to hate. This is kind of a fun one for certain genres, right? Especially things that are like social satire, or things that are romance novels, or things that are like adventure, or especially like superhero movie type things. All of these is kind of fun to have the antagonist you love to hate. They're kind of ridiculous. They're over the top. They're such an idiot sometimes, or they're so evil. They hate the protagonist, but there's something about what they do that makes it that they're fun to read despite all of that, right? I like that. There's like a method to their madness. And there's like something that they do that you're like, okay, I know I should hate them, but they're funny. Or I know I should hate them, but they're very stylish, right? Or I know I should hate them, but once in a while they do something that's actually nice. Those things are kind of fun as well. I think that that's really, really cool. You don't want your antagonist to just be too relentlessly horrible, because it doesn't have any dimension and it starts to look like an absolutely cliched caricature. And, you don't want to deal with that. In recent years, I really think that antagonists have becoming more and more sympathetic in general, right? Because there's been a trend for these unreliable narrators, protagonists who aren't really perfect and who like behave more like an antagonist than a protagonist, and then some antagonists who act more like a protagonist. And sometimes there's some kind of a flip-flop, right, in the book. And so you know that these two characters are like antagonistic forces against each other, and really it's up to the reader to determine, which one is good or bad. And sometimes, the truth is a little bit more nuanced than that, right? So remember, you can make that antagonist a little bit sympathetic because, they've got that backstory. They've got those nuances to them. They've got the sense of humor. They've got the style. They have all of that stuff. I like that. Also, your antagonist could be conflicted, right? So I think it's very important for your protagonist to be pretty set on what their goal is. Even if they're conflicted over how they're going to get it and everything else, they are pretty darn sure that they need to act to go towards their goal. Now, your antagonist is also pretty powerful, but they might be a little bit conflicted. They might make a little effort to change. They might have a chink in the armor once in a while, and that can be pretty interesting, right? So you might be, deciding to root against some type of antagonist, but also be like, wait a second, maybe they're not that bad, right? Maybe there's something charming, and maybe they're going to come through at some point for the protagonist. Like, look at the Loki characters, in all the Marvel movies, on Thor, all of that. Loki is always an antagonist, but also once in a while, it's kind of complicated. You're kind of like, oh, is he actually going to change? And he never does, right? So I think it's kind of funny. We talked about these antagonists that represent something, right? A power that be or something else. And we usually talk about an antagonist being one person, but you can have a group of people, right? Be an antagonist. And it's kind of fun. Like, if you think about the movie Mean Girls, this is a great example. You've got these girls and they all have these different traits, and together they create this one great antagonist. And it means that when you got a couple people who are an antagonistic force, it means that you don't have to depend on a lone bad guy. Like, you can basically have all these different character traits that can almost be contradictory, and it creates a lot more nuance as well. But really make sure that we get to know each character as much as we need to so that we are actually relating to them. Now, in terms of your storytelling, I've been talking about a lot of the traits of a good antagonist. I've been talking about, how to make them more nuanced, how to, have them be the worthy opponent to your protagonist. But when do we meet them? How do we introduce them? What kind of scenes are they in, and how do we write them in, right? Listen, we do need to meet the protagonist usually up front, right? But do we meet the antagonist up front? Not always, right? Sometimes that antagonist is lurking in the shadows, right? But what we do have up front is that we do have some antagonistic forces. So those antagonistic forces are going to be kind of sneaking up and, kind of making the reader know that there is some kind of an antagonist in the background, or somebody who maybe represents these forces. And that's going to be something. So you get to tease that out. You need to make that person the antagonistic forces incarnate. But when do we meet them, right? Sometimes the antagonist only shows up at the climactic moment. Like, we knew that maybe a person like this existed, right? They were doing things all along. They were working against your protagonist, but we didn't know when they were going to show up. Here's the thing, though. Their force needs to be felt, right? Their force needs to be felt throughout. We can never forget that there are antagonistic forces working against your protagonist, or we're going to lose momentum. That's really important. So you definitely want your readers to know, that they need to identify with the protagonist and want them to succeed in their goals, no matter whether they're perfect or not, right? You're building up a bias to be pulling for one of the characters. Kind of interesting. I always ask this question to my clients, which is, how does the antagonist hold up a mirror to your protagonist? If they're that kind of antagonist that really reflects on your protagonist, they are definitely going to be more effective if they're in more scenes with your protagonist, if possible, or if they're in more scenes where we see these similarities. That's going to be really important. So think about all of that and think about, okay, do they know each other? Are they meeting them and when? How do they hold a mirror up to them and how does that moment kind of reveal itself? Because that whole realizing that your protagonist and antagonist are kind of similar is really satisfying if it's kind of an aha moment for your reader. I kind of like that. Just think about what kind of scenes they're going to be appearing in and give them as strong a purpose as possible, right? A lot of writers love their protagonists, so they love developing them and creating a lot of scenes in them. And that's fun because lots of times the reader really enjoys that, right? So make sure that if you are doing that sort of thing, you really want to give enough attention to the antagonist. Since they're taking place in so many scenes, they need to be really fleshed out. So they need to be present. We need to know why they are acting against your protagonist. We need to know what the ideals and values are, what their personality is, if it's a person, right? Make sure you're rounding them out as much as you've done for your protagonist. Lack of attention to your protagonist can lead to a massive problem, which is this whole syndrome where you feel like your protagonist and your antagonist and a bunch of other characters are a little bit too much like side characters. They're just kind of their interactions come off as kind of superficial and not interesting because they're a little side charactery. And really, your antagonist is definitely one of the main characters. And that's really important. So make sure that they have the strengths and the weaknesses and the nuance. Other things that you can think of doing is that if your antagonist is showing up a little late in the story, foreshadow that arrival. Tease it out. Make the reader wait for this arrival and think, oh my God, when are they going to show up, right? And you can then make it super dramatic, or you could make it anticlimactic, right? Whichever one serves your story. That's really fun to do, right? So you need to remember too that if this antagonist is going to show up at some point, which is usually the climactic moment, there is going to be a confrontation between these people, right? And that's going to be when the conflict really comes to life and that we're really seeing what the stakes are. And we're going to see this dramatic confrontation with lots of tension. So remember that the conflict is key. Remember that the opposing forces must be matched when it comes to strength. And that's going to deliver a lot of suspense because the reader's never going to know if your character's really going to be able to actually overcome all these antagonistic forces. I hope that this made a lot of sense. I think it might have opened your eyes to some of the possibilities of an antagonist beyond just the traditional villain, and that you're seeing how key it is to have an antagonist or antagonistic forces in your book, no matter what kind of book you are writing. I would love to hear from you. If you have an antagonist that you're struggling with, make sure to give me a call. I've got the free 15-minute calls. Or if you're a member of Writing Coach on Demand, you can be asking me questions about your antagonist over and over every week if you like. You can show up in office hours. And also you're going to have all these wonderful worksheets to work with. And obviously when I come out with my course very, very soon, from idea to published in 6 months, there is going to be a whole section on antagonists. And this that you just listened to is going to be a fantastic foundation for that. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to being with you next time on the How to Be an Author podcast. If you have any pressing writing-related questions or would like to be featured on the How to Be an Author podcast, please feel free to reach out on my website, creativeandwritingcoach.com.